For years, the world saw the Braxton family as a symbol of strength, faith, and unbreakable unity. At the center of that powerful dynamic stood one woman, Evelyn Braxton, the matriarch who raised her daughters with discipline, ambition, and a deep belief that family always comes first. From the outside, it looked like the perfect formula that helped produce stars like Toni Braxton and the outspoken, unforgettable TAMAR Braxton. But what happens when the same authority that built a family's success also becomes the source of years of emotional pressure? Recently, TAMAR began speaking more openly about the weight she says she carried growing up in that environment. And according to her reflections, the pain didn't come from one explosive argument or a single dramatic moment. It came from something quieter, patterns that repeated for years. Patterns where love sometimes felt conditional, where approval mattered more than self-expression, and where challenging the rules of the family dynamic could reportedly come with consequences that lasted long after the moment passed. When TAMAR finally started describing how those experiences affected her, fans noticed something surprising. Her words didn't sound like anger. They sounded like someone who had spent years trying to survive, and was only now beginning to explain why. For decades, the public image of the Braxton family looked almost unshakable. Their story was built around faith, music, and a strong matriarch who guided her daughters through a difficult industry. At the center of that structure stood Evelyn Braxton, the woman many fans credit for raising one of the most recognizable musical families in modern R&B history. Her daughters, including Toni Braxton and TAMAR Braxton, often spoke publicly about how their mother's strict parenting style shaped their work ethic and resilience. According to family stories shared in interviews and television appearances, Evelyn believed in discipline, faith, and preparation. She pushed her daughters to sing in church, to practice constantly, and to treat their talents as serious responsibilities rather than casual hobbies. From the outside, that approach seemed to work. Toni eventually became one of the most successful R&B singers of her generation, earning global recognition and a long list of awards. Her success opened doors not only for herself, but for the rest of her sisters as well. Over time, the Braxton name became associated with musical excellence and family unity. But the story behind that success was always more complicated than it appeared on the surface. In many families built around ambition and discipline, the same structure that produces success can also create emotional pressure that builds quietly over time. And according to reflections that TAMAR has shared in recent years, that pressure was something she felt deeply growing up. Unlike Toni, whose calm personality often matched the expectations of a structured household, TAMAR had always been different. She was expressive, emotional, outspoken, and often unfiltered. That energy made her incredibly entertaining to audiences later in her career, but inside the family dynamic it sometimes created friction. People who followed the Braxtons through interviews and television appearances noticed that TAMAR's personality was the loudest in the room. She joked more, reacted more strongly to conflict, and expressed her emotions in ways that were difficult to ignore. But behind that bold personality, TAMAR has suggested there were moments where she felt misunderstood within the family system she grew up in. According to TAMAR's perspective, being the most expressive sibling sometimes meant being labeled as the most difficult. In families where discipline and order are highly valued, emotional reactions can sometimes be seen as disruption rather than communication. Over time, TAMAR reportedly began feeling that her voice was not always welcomed in the same way as others. The environment the Braxton sisters grew up in was shaped heavily by Evelyn's strong leadership style. As a mother raising multiple talented daughters while navigating financial challenges and the demands of the music industry, Evelyn carried enormous responsibility. Friends of the family have often described her as protective and determined, someone who believed her role was to prepare her daughters for a world that would not always treat them kindly. From Evelyn's perspective, strict guidance was a form of protection. However, TAMAR has implied that the experience of living under that constant guidance sometimes felt overwhelming. The line between advice and control, she suggested, could become difficult to see when expectations were always present. For TAMAR, the tension wasn't about one single moment where everything changed. Instead, she described a gradual build-up of emotional weight. It was the feeling that decisions about her life were often filtered through what was considered best for the family image. It was the pressure to respond to situations in ways that maintained harmony rather than expressing her true feelings. And over time, that pattern reportedly left her feeling as though her individuality had to be managed rather than celebrated. When the Braxton family eventually stepped into reality television with the show Braxton Family Values, audiences finally saw glimpses of the complex dynamic between the sisters and their mother. The show highlighted arguments, emotional conversations, and moments where the sisters disagreed about everything from career choices to personal relationships. For viewers, those scenes were entertaining and dramatic. But for the family members involved, they represented real emotions playing out under the pressure of cameras and public attention. TAMAR quickly became one of the most talked about personalities on the show. Her humor, sharp commentary, and emotional reactions made her a standout figure, but they also sometimes made her the center of conflict. In several episodes, viewers saw TAMAR clash with her sisters or push back against decisions being made for the group. While those moments often appeared playful or dramatic on screen, TAMAR later suggested that they reflected deeper feelings she had been carrying for years. What many viewers interpreted as dramatic behavior, TAMAR described as frustration that had been building quietly long before cameras were ever present. According to TAMAR, growing up in a family where expectations were high sometimes meant that expressing discomfort felt risky. Disagreeing with authority figures within the family could lead to tension that lingered long after the argument ended. Over time, TAMAR said she began developing habits that helped her survive those situations emotionally. Humor became a shield. Loud reactions became a way to be heard in environments where quieter emotions might be overlooked. But those coping strategies came with consequences. As TAMAR's public personality grew bigger through television and music projects, critics often labeled her dramatic, overly emotional, or attention-seeking. What many people didn't realize was that some of those behaviors were deeply connected to how she had learned to navigate family dynamics long before fame entered the picture. TAMAR has suggested that part of the pain she experienced came from feeling misunderstood both inside and outside the family. When she tried to explain her perspective, some listeners dismissed her feelings as exaggeration. Others argued that she should simply be grateful for the opportunities her family structure helped create. That response, according to TAMAR, made it even harder to express what she was going through emotionally. Because when someone's pain is repeatedly minimized, they may begin questioning whether their feelings are valid at all. Over time, the tension between TAMAR's personality and the expectations surrounding her role in the family continued to grow. The more success the Braxton brand achieved, the more pressure there was to maintain a united public image. And maintaining that image sometimes meant keeping certain emotions hidden from the world. For TAMAR, that balancing act eventually became exhausting. She had to perform confidence and humor in public while privately navigating feelings that she felt were rarely acknowledged. By the time TAMAR began speaking more openly about these experiences, years had already passed. The patterns she described weren't new, but finally naming them out loud changed how people began looking at the Braxton family dynamic. What once appeared to be simple disagreements between strong personalities started to look like something more layered. A daughter trying to express her individuality inside a system built around structure. A mother trying to protect her children in the only way she believed worked. And a family navigating the complicated space between love, discipline, and emotional freedom. Those dynamics would eventually lead to moments where TAMAR felt completely overwhelmed, moments where the pressure she had been carrying quietly for years finally reached a breaking point. And when those moments happened, the world watching from the outside would begin to realize that the Braxton family story was far more complicated than anyone first believed. As the years passed, the tension that TAMAR Braxton had quietly carried didn't suddenly disappear when fame arrived. In many ways, it grew heavier. Success tends to magnify whatever dynamics already exist inside a family, and for the Braxtons, the spotlight only made their internal pressures more visible. When the family stepped into reality television through Braxton family values, audiences believed they were getting a fun, and sometimes chaotic look at a famous musical family. The show delivered laughter, arguments, emotional moments, and sisterly bonds that felt relatable despite the fame. But behind those scenes, TAMAR has since suggested that the cameras captured only fragments of a much deeper story. On screen, TAMAR often appeared as the bold, outspoken sister who never hesitated to say exactly what she felt. She joked loudly, reacted dramatically, and sometimes clashed openly with her sisters. Many viewers saw those moments as entertaining television. Critics, however, began attaching labels to her personality. Some described her as too much. Others said she was overly emotional or confrontational. But according to TAMAR's later reflections, those reactions misunderstood what was actually happening beneath the surface. What looked like dramatic outbursts was sometimes the result of years of frustration that had never fully been addressed. The presence of cameras added a new layer of complexity to the family dynamic. Every disagreement suddenly had an audience. Every emotional reaction could be replayed, analyzed, and judged by millions of viewers who only saw a carefully edited portion of the situation. Inside that environment, TAMAR often found herself in a difficult position. She was trying to navigate personal emotions, while also performing for a television format designed around conflict and drama. Meanwhile, the powerful influence of the family matriarch, Evelyn Braxton, continued to shape the way decisions were made within the family. Evelyn had always been deeply involved in guiding her daughter's choices, offering advice on relationships, careers, and personal behavior. For many of the sisters, that involvement felt normal. It was the structure they had grown up with. But TAMAR began suggesting that the level of influence sometimes made it difficult for her to establish boundaries as an adult. The conflict between independence and family loyalty slowly became more visible. TAMAR was no longer a child living under her mother's roof. She was a successful entertainer building her own career and public identity. Yet the expectations that had existed during her childhood reportedly never fully disappeared. That tension created moments where TAMAR felt she had to choose between expressing her own perspective and maintaining peace within the family structure. According to TAMAR's description of those experiences, the most confusing part was that the pressure rarely came from obvious hostility. Instead, it often arrived in the language of care and protection. Advice was framed as guidance. Criticism was framed as concern. Over time, TAMAR began realizing that the emotional impact of those interactions felt very different from the intentions behind them. That realization marked a major turning point in how she understood her past. In several interviews and discussions over the years, TAMAR began reflecting on the difference between intent and impact. She acknowledged that her mother likely believed she was protecting and guiding her daughters the best way she knew how. But TAMAR also explained that the emotional effects of that guidance sometimes left her feeling unheard or controlled. For TAMAR, recognizing that difference was deeply unsettling. It meant confronting the possibility that a system built on love and protection could still create emotional harm without anyone deliberately intending it. That idea challenged the narrative many fans had about the Braxton family. For years, viewers had admired their unity and strength. The thought that those same dynamics might carry hidden emotional strain forced people to reconsider what they had been watching. The shift became even more noticeable as fans revisited past moments from the show. Scenes that once looked like ordinary family disagreements suddenly appeared more layered. Tamar's emotional reactions seemed less like random drama, and more like the visible result of deeper tension. Online discussions began analyzing old episodes, interviews, and public appearances in a completely new light. Some viewers defended Evelyn fiercely, pointing out the sacrifices she made raising her daughters and guiding them toward success. Others sympathized with Tamar's experience, arguing that strict parenting can sometimes cross into emotional pressure without realizing it. The debate wasn't really about choosing sides. It was about understanding how complicated family relationships can become when expectations, love, and authority are deeply intertwined. At the center of the conversation stood Tamar herself, whose words had unexpectedly reshaped how people interpreted her entire public history. Moments that critics once used as evidence of her dramatic personality now looked different to some viewers. Instead of seeing a performer exaggerating emotions for attention, people began seeing someone who might have been reacting to years of unresolved feelings. That shift didn't immediately resolve the tension surrounding the situation. In fact, it made the conversation even more complicated. Because acknowledging Tamar's experience didn't automatically mean blaming her mother. It meant accepting that two truths could exist at the same time. Evelyn could have genuinely believed she was doing what was best for her daughters. And Tamar could still feel deeply affected by the way those decisions shaped her emotional life. When Tamar spoke about the patterns she experienced growing up, she didn't frame them as a single dramatic confrontation. She described repetition. Small moments accumulating over years. Expectations that rarely loosened even as she became an adult. For Tamar, the most painful realization was that those patterns had become so normal that she didn't recognize their impact until much later in life. That kind of realization can be unsettling, because it forces someone to revisit their entire personal history with new perspective. Events that once seemed harmless suddenly carry different meaning. And once someone begins naming those feelings out loud, the people around them must decide how to respond. Inside the Braxton family, the reaction wasn't an immediate public confrontation. Instead, according to sources close to the situation, the response was quieter than many expected. There were no explosive rebuttals. No dramatic press statements. Instead, there was distance. Conversations slowed down. Communication reportedly became more cautious as everyone processed what Tamar had said. That silence created a strange moment of uncertainty. Fans waiting for a clear resolution didn't receive one. The family didn't rush to publicly debate Tamar's claims, or attempt to rewrite her experience. In a media culture where celebrity conflicts often escalate quickly through social media and interviews, that restraint stood out. And it left one big question hanging in the air. If Tamar had finally spoken about years of emotional pressure, what would happen next inside the family relationships that had shaped her entire life? Because once someone names pain that has existed for years, the story doesn't simply end with that confession. That's when the real consequences begin to unfold. The aftermath of Tamar's words didn't erupt into a dramatic public feud. Instead, it unfolded slowly, almost quietly, in a way that many people found even more unsettling. When someone finally speaks about pain that has existed for years, the response isn't always loud confrontation. Sometimes it's reflection. Sometimes it's distance. And sometimes it's silence while everyone involved tries to understand what has just been said. For Tamar Braxton, speaking openly about how she experienced her upbringing reportedly brought both relief and vulnerability at the same time. Sharing emotions that had been held inside for years meant that the story was now public. Once those words existed outside her own thoughts, they could be interpreted, debated, misunderstood, or supported by people who had never lived inside the Braxton family dynamic. That reality alone can be overwhelming. According to people familiar with the situation, the days after Tamar began expressing those reflections were filled with complicated emotions. On one hand, she had finally articulated something she had been processing for years. On the other hand, she knew that the world would inevitably analyze every word she had said. Fans, critics, and commentators began revisiting old footage from Braxton family values and other public appearances involving the family. Moments that once seemed like ordinary disagreements suddenly looked more serious to some viewers. Tamar's emotional reactions in those scenes felt different when placed next to her recent reflections about long-term pressure. People began noticing small details that previously went ignored. A tense pause in a conversation. A comment that sounded like a joke, but carried a sharper edge underneath. A moment where Tamar appeared defensive even when the topic seemed minor. None of those clips proved anything by themselves. But together they created a new lens through which the public viewed Tamar's past behavior. For years, critics had described her personality as dramatic or reactive. Now some viewers were reconsidering whether those reactions might have been rooted in deeper emotional patterns that had never been fully understood. Meanwhile, attention also shifted toward the family matriarch, Evelyn Braxton. Evelyn had always been portrayed as the strong foundation holding the Braxton family together. Her reputation as a protective and disciplined mother was something many fans admired. Because of that reputation, Tamar's reflections placed Evelyn in an uncomfortable position within the public conversation. Supporters of Evelyn quickly pointed out that raising a family of talented daughters, while navigating financial hardship and the pressures of the music industry, was no easy task. They argued that strict parenting often comes from a desire to prepare children for difficult realities. In their view, Evelyn's guidance helped create the opportunities that eventually led to the family's success. Others, however, focused on Tamar's description of how that guidance felt from the inside. They argued that intention and impact can be very different things. A parent might believe they are protecting their child, while unintentionally creating emotional pressure that becomes difficult to escape. The debate grew across social media platforms and entertainment commentary channels. Some people framed Tamar's experience as an example of how strict family structures can blur the line between support and control. Others warned against judging complex family dynamics from the outside based only on fragments of information. What made the conversation unique was that neither Tamar nor Evelyn appeared eager to escalate it publicly. In many celebrity disputes, both sides quickly release statements defending their perspectives. Interviews follow, and the conflict becomes a cycle of responses and counter-responses. But in this situation, the reaction from the Braxton family was noticeably restrained. There were no immediate attempts to discredit Tamar's feelings. At the same time, there were no dramatic public apologies that tried to simplify the situation either. Instead, there was a pause. According to sources close to the family, that pause reflected something deeper than public relations strategy. The issues Tamar described involved years of shared history, emotional complexity, and relationships that extended far beyond what could be explained in a single interview. Family members reportedly needed time to process what had been said and consider how to move forward without reducing the situation to headlines. For Tamar, that period of quiet reflection may have been just as important as the moment when she first spoke about her experiences. Naming emotional pain is only the first step in understanding it. What follows is often a long process of re-evaluating memories, boundaries, and expectations. Friends of Tamar have suggested that she was not seeking public punishment for anyone in her family. Her goal, they say, was recognition, the simple acknowledgement that her feelings existed and deserved to be heard. Recognition is a powerful thing. When someone feels that their experiences have been dismissed or misunderstood for years, being heard can change how they relate to their own past. It doesn't erase what happened, but it can make healing feel possible. At the same time, recognition can also challenge the people hearing that perspective. If someone has always believed they were acting out of love, hearing that their actions caused pain can be difficult to accept. That tension sits at the center of the story between Tamar and Evelyn. Both women appear to be holding onto truths that matter deeply to them. Tamar is holding onto her emotional experience and the impact she believes certain patterns had on her life. Evelyn, according to those who know her, continues to see her role as a mother who tried to guide and protect her children the best way she knew how. Neither perspective automatically cancels the other. And that is what makes the situation so complicated. Family relationships are rarely simple enough to fit into the categories of hero and villain. They are built from years of decisions, sacrifices, misunderstandings, and love that sometimes expresses itself in imperfect ways. As time passed after Tamar's comments, the public conversation slowly shifted. Instead of demanding a dramatic resolution, more people began reflecting on the broader questions her story raised. How do families balance discipline with emotional freedom? When does protection begin to feel like control? And how do adult children revisit their childhood experiences without completely dismantling the relationships that shaped them? For Tamar, the story did not end with one interview or one public reflection. The real outcome will likely unfold over years, not headlines. Healing inside families often happens quietly, far away from cameras and public debate. The most surprising part of this entire situation might be what Tamar chose not to do afterward. She didn't continue repeating the accusations, or escalate the conversation into an ongoing public dispute. Instead, according to people close to her, she focused on personal growth and understanding the emotions she had been carrying for so long. That choice suggests something important about the way Tamar sees this chapter of her life. It isn't about revenge. It's about clarity. Once someone finally understands how certain experiences affected them, they face a new question: what happens next? Do those realizations create permanent distance between family members? Or can they open the door to a new kind of relationship built on honesty rather than silence? For the Braxton family, that question still remains unanswered. The story hasn't reached a dramatic conclusion, and perhaps it never will. What Tamar shared wasn't a final chapter. It was the beginning of a conversation about how love, discipline, and emotional impact can exist together in complicated ways. And sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that end not with a resolution, but with the possibility that understanding might still be growing somewhere behind the scenes. Stories like this often leave people with more questions than answers. When Tamar Braxton finally opened up about the emotional weight she says she carried for years, it didn't just spark a conversation about one family. It sparked a much bigger discussion about how complicated love, discipline, and family expectations can be. And at the center of that discussion is the powerful presence of Evelyn Braxton, a mother many still respect deeply for the strength and guidance she gave her daughters. But here's the question that keeps dividing people. Can someone truly believe they are protecting you, while their actions still leave emotional scars over time? Some fans feel Tamar simply shared her truth after years of silence. Others believe family struggles should remain private, especially when a parent's intentions may have always been rooted in love. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Tamar was right to finally speak about how those experiences affected her? Or do you believe situations like this are too complex for the public to fully understand from the outside? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, so you don't miss the next deep dive into the stories behind some of the biggest names in entertainment.